All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hey everyone, Jody here. One more episode in our little series where we are pairing some of our favorite episodes with stories from our fellow Radiotopia shows who have covered the same topic or theme. Today, HBCUs. First, we will bring you our episode on the founding of the first historically black college, and then an episode from the Stoop about HBCUs, the culture on campus, the important space that's created there, and it also features an interview with Stacey Abrams. This is a really interesting pairing. Our episode is first. Here we go. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 29th, 1854, by an act of the Pennsylvania legislature, the Ashman Institute is founded, the first college founded solely for African American students. This is the day on which it was officially chartered. Ashman, the college was named after Jehudi Ashman, a Quaker leader and social reformer who was very active in the American Colonization Society, that early Back to Africa movement. We've done an episode on that before if you want to go listen. It is no longer called the Ashman Institute. It is now known as Lincoln University, and it is the oldest HBCU in the country. Or is it? Here to discuss is, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kelly Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hey, Jody.
Hey there.
So Kelly, I have my little cliffhanger in the intro there. What is that's what counts for cliffhanger on this show. What is the controversy, including with Ashman, about what is the oldest HBCU in the country?
So there is a question as to, are they the oldest university, the first degree granting university? I mean, there's so many caveats that could be put on the first one to educate, African Americans, and specifically African Americans, and have a charter attached to them. So there are a lot of different pivots that people use to establish themselves as the first. But this rivalry goes back so old. I mean, if you think about Cheney University, that has on its website, we are the first and oldest historically black college, dating back to like 1834. But these rivalries are pretty common. Even my own alma mater, Howard University, we go back and forth about what is the real HU, Howard University or Hampton University. So they're fun, I think, but historically it depends on how you want to categorize what you mean by first, and if you mean by granting institutions or which was the first university, which is the first college, all of that, it depends on semantics.
So Cheney's claim is that it was the first institution of higher learning, and it was founded a decade or so before Ashman. Ashman was the first, as I gather, to actually offer degrees.
Yes.
So that seems to be one of the distinctions. And then every once in a while in these conversations, Wilberforce University in Ohio sneaks in because in 1856, and on their website, they bill themselves as the nation's oldest private historically black university. Yes. They seem to be the first one that was founded by that had a black leadership and black founders. So this reminds me a lot of like the oldest bar in America, and then it's like continuously operated by one owner, and never closed in a fire or whatever. My parents live in a town that claims to have the oldest inn in America, but it's got like these 5 caveats after it about, so forth. But,
having that claim to fame, though, is just so, it's like it's bragging rights is what it is.
Yeah, just keep an eye on how many adjectives there are describing what exactly it is the oldest of. Yeah.
So, Nikki, what is your sense, though, in the founding of Ashman? How does it come together, and who are the, we mentioned that it's named after this man. What's his name? Let's put him on the list of great names that we encountered. Jedi Ashman. What does it mean that it is named after this white man in Pennsylvania?
So, it's a pretty good snapshot of the distinction between something like Ashman Institute and Wilberforce, because the Ashman Institute was founded by white Quakers. The Quakers were pretty involved in both the American colonization movement, but also in the abolition movement. And they saw as part of their project the founding of colleges like Ashman. Although I will say Ashman from the start was open to and encouraging of white students to enroll. And so there's a way in which it's a historically Black college, but it also is, it's an integrated. So it has kind of those two legacies to it, because I think of who the founders were and what they were trying to do there in Pennsylvania.
And we should say that most of the first presidents of historically Black colleges and universities were white people, or white men, I should say. And so that becomes sort of like the genesis story for a lot of these schools. You have like Howard University is named after, General Oliver Otis Howard. And so when you think about the fact that there's white leadership at the helm, it's not unusual at the time to have that, and to have white students attending initially, at least.
When we did that episode about the ACS and the Colonization Society, we talked a lot about the sort of emerging different strands of abolition and anti-slavery. And in there, we talked about how there was first off, there was a sort of very patriarchal, patronizing sort of approach in many ways. We're going to help take ex-slaves or take slaves and send them back to Africa, and in a way to avoid the sort of confronting the problem here in this country. And I wonder if there's any of that, Kelly, as you see it floating around in here, establishing an institution rather than say fighting for integration of established white institutions.
Most HBCUs are started to train preachers and teachers, and that expands as we get closer to the 20th century. But that initial idea about using schools as a way to create ministers who can go out and sort of serve as missionaries to the broader public and all throughout the world really was something at the forefront of a lot of these schools. And then also teaching teachers or educating students to become teachers to also educate other people was a big part of that as well. So I always think that when we think about education in general, and this is at white schools and Black schools, the idea of training people up to be a particular kind of citizen or to contribute a particular skill or mindset, perpetuate a particular kind of mindset, is at the forefront of all of these institutions.
Yeah, and this is a moment in 1854 that mission of education is actually, the language doesn't sound particularly paternalistic. It is coming at a moment when education is forbidden for enslaved people in the South. It's coming at a moment when the laws around free Black people were becoming more and more strict. So in the 1830s, Pennsylvania outlaws Black voting. And so it is a kind of act of rebellion in some ways against those ideas. And I think that's an important context for Ashman. I'm
curious, Kelly, you said, this idea of an institution that is built to train a certain kind of citizen, build up a certain kind of citizen. Did you feel that at all when you were at Howard? Many, many years later, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There, and all of these HBCUs have such rich histories and notable alumni that when you go to these schools, you are inculcated with the idea that you epitomize Black excellence. You are, right now, I think Howard alum are kind of insufferable because we're all like thinking about the vice presidency and thinking about all of these different, when we think of like Stacey Abrams, she's a Spelman alum, like HBCUs are running it lately, and we're kind of loving that. But I do think that when you go there, you feel a part of a historical heritage. When you think about Ashmun Institute, which later becomes Lincoln University, Thurgood Marshall graduates from there, and Langston Hughes graduates from there. You have so many famous, notable alumni that you want to sort of perpetuate that.
Gil Scott Heron, by the way. That one caught my eye.
When I saw that name, I was like, oh, that's Jody will pick that one up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I know. It's really cool. I mean, one of the things I love about going back to Howard is to be able to like see all of the, alumni and sort of like call out these famous people and see yourselves like, in the same shared spaces with them, wherever you lived in a dorm or what building you took classes in. Like that's really powerful.
Given that HBCUs come out of segregation, that they come out of a lack of opportunity, they become the training ground of the Black elites, and they become this very powerful space for networking and connections and history and sort of a shared culture that it's really powerful.
It's like
and
a
those
fraternity or a sorority.
Yeah.
It is. There's a lot of, I should say, there is a lot of competition. As a Howard alum, I'm always talking smack about Hampton. But when it comes down to like how we feel about each other, how we feel about our institutions, there's so much pride there. I got to go to Lincoln University for the first time, I think maybe a few years ago, in 2018, I want to say, to give a speaking engagement. And the campus is beautiful. It's out in like Amish country, or are the Amish that are there? I think it's the Amish.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful, and these are places where you can just take pride in feeling like other people shared this space with you, and the legacy of that, and the bragging rights.
This is far too magnanimous, Kelly. I want to stay on the rivalries and the talking smack.
He's like, what are you going to say about Spelman people?
Yeah, exactly.
I can talk smack all
at the end, I want to ask you if you feel like Howard has won the HBCU wars, but we'll get to that.
Totally.
Okay, we'll get to that. But,
that's a preview.
But in this moment, I mean, it does seem like we have the year we're talking about here is 1853, 1854. It does seem in the aftermath of the Civil War certainly is a moment where a lot of these schools are founded around the country.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly, I think it's pretty obvious why Ashmun changes its name to Lincoln University after the assassination. But Kelly, I'm curious what you think about that sort of burgeoning, and then also just this idea that I think a lot of people, when they think HBCUs, they think Southern institutions. And you look at this early crop, and a lot of them are in Pennsylvania, Ohio. I mean, we can have that big argument about whether D.C. is the South or not, but Howard, it's not the deep South. So what do you make of that?
It's really interesting because I would say most of the HBCUs are in the South. So I think of Tennessee, I think of Louisiana, Texas, Georgia for sure, Mississippi, Alabama, Tuskegee, the famed Tuskegee Institute. I think of Fisk. I think of all of these places in which this is where Black people were. The majority of Black people were in the South. And so if you wanted to create these institutions, you had to build them where Black people were. And so that's part of it. Black people are in Ohio. Free Black people are in Ohio in large pockets. Lots of Black people are in Pennsylvania and in the nation's capital. And so that's why you don't see a lot of historically Black colleges in Boston or in, New York City or things of that nature, or California even. They were built around the communities that they were intended to serve. And so that is why you see a lot of that. But, I also think that most people don't really know, which HBCUs are actually considered HBCUs and, what qualifies you to be historically Black college. I think that's what allows them to be these distinguished institutions, is that they're created to serve largely African-American students. Although 1 in 4 now are non-African-American or non-Black. But that, I think, is, sort of the beauty of this, that these were intended to serve a population that had been marginalized.
Yeah, I would add one structural layer on as well, and that is in 1890 you get the passage of the Second Morrill Act, and it requires in the funding of land grant universities, that if you're in a segregated space, that you have to create a land grant university for Black students as well as white students. And so that leads in the late 19th century to the growth of another surge of historically Black colleges and universities in the South as well. So there's a lot of things that are feeding into this growth, to the extent that you have, how many now, Kelly?
Oh gosh, there's at least 101 HBCUs. So I mean, there's so many. There's some that I don't even know about, and I kind of pride myself on knowing almost all of them. But there are some that are a smaller, and that don't have the sort of prominence. I feel like we are familiar with your sort of top five, which is your Howards, your Hamptons, Spelman, Morehouse, FAMU is a part of that. But also, I think Lincoln and Fisk and Texas Southern and Southern Louisiana, Xavier is big. All of these schools became big because when you wanted to find that Black doctor, that Black lawyer, that Black engineer, these were the schools that you had to go to because white schools weren't graduating Black students in that way. So even when we think about, Hidden Figures and the NASA program, like they had to go to these Black institutions like Virginia Union and Hampton to find Black talent.
And that actually connects to something that Nikki just said about the sort of the Morrill Act, MORRIL, that created land grant universities. And I just had always heard this phrase, land grant university, and it wasn't until here that I finally got my head around what that actually is. But, these were acts that basically said we're going to offer public land to institutions of higher learning. And that's where a lot of public universities, and also, as you were saying, Kelly, a lot of universities that are more geared towards agricultural science, military science, engineering, a lot of those universities come out of this land grant programs as opposed to like private liberal art colleges, which often have private land and so forth. So that is where you get that phrase and and you actually sort of see that connection between the structure of how the university is founded and the kinds of teaching as we've been discussing.
And it's interesting too because a lot of these schools they dub themselves, like Lincoln University is dubbed like the Black Princeton.
Yeah.
They have a way of saying like, oh my gosh, our colors are similar, our mascots are similar. Like our president was actually educated at Princeton, so we're just gonna dub ourselves the Black Princeton. And there's a lot of pride about it.
And they're like really close to each other, right? Just like 20 miles or something, right? So
yeah. But even at Howard, people are like, oh, Howard, isn't that the Black Harvard or whatever? And I'm like, no, Harvard is the white Howard.
So as we wrap up, I want to get your thoughts on one other element here, which is we've named some of the prominent alumni of Lincoln University, but you look at that list and there are also a number of really notable folks from other countries who have come and become educated at Lincoln. So the first president of Nigeria, the first president of Ghana, a bunch of people in the 70s and 80s, Black South Africans came and got educated and then became leaders, business leaders, political leaders when they returned. And I'm curious, what your thoughts are on that sort of, I don't even know what to call it, like the sort of reverse diaspora or something, of Black leaders from other places coming to the United States.
That's what makes HBCUs so special is because, we know that being Black is not a monolith, but the idea that you have an entire diaspora of not just people from Africa, but also from the West Indies. I think of Eric Williams, who's the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, attends Howard University. So you have people coming from all four corners of the world to be educated because of the rich legacy, one. Two, because it's one of the few places that they can actually be educated in a safe space, quote unquote. And then also they can take that back and then connect these bridges between one institution and an entire country. So the relationships that Ghana has with Howard and with Lincoln, simply because Kwame Nkrumah is the president, was educated there. And then Kwame Nkrumah's son, I think, attends Howard University. So there are all of these connections throughout the diaspora that really make being Black feel so global.
I like that you're doing very good analysis, but you are certainly sprinkling in a lot of very prestigious Howard alums.
You noticed that?
Yeah, I noticed that.
She came in with a mission.
I sure did.
Okay, so as we wrap up, give us your 30 seconds. Why is Howard top of the list?
Oh my gosh. I mean, 30 seconds is not enough time at all. But I will say this, I feel like I found myself at Howard University.
Yeah.
I was embraced, and I got to see what Black excellence looked like up close, and I got to see professors that assumed I was smart, assumed I was talented and ready for the task. And so, and also, I think being in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, you feel like you're in the heart of so much. And it's just a special place to be educated. And now, you know, the home, too, of our Vice President, Kamala Harris. I had to throw that in there.
I think you're legally required to as a function of your degree.
I think so.
And you can walk to Ben's Chili Bowl for lunch, which is, I've always been jealous of.
Good times in D.C. Good times.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And now an episode from The Stoop, the Radiotopia show that brings you stories from the Black diaspora. Here are Hannah and Leela.
The Stoop.
The Stoop.
The Stoop. Stories from across the Black diaspora
that we need to talk about.
My cousins were water and grease girls, and I couldn't be a water and grease girl.
That's what I'm talking about, ballerina in the hood.
We be Gullah Geechee United people.
When a Black woman walks up to the desk in labor, what preconceived notions do you have about her?
I didn't even know we had a hair chart.
Hey, Hannah.
Hey, Leela.
I just thought maybe I would feel really out of place, you know? And I never really talked about it because I felt, you know, I always felt a little bit embarrassed that I felt a little bit intimidated. And so to hear, you know, how that can turn into like a really beautiful experience for you, it's really inspiring.
Leela, that was you talking to Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
About your decision not to go to an HBCU.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sensing a little bit of regret.
Yeah. We both sat down, me and you sat down with Stacey Abrams a while ago to talk about her decision to go to a HBCU. And I was feeling super emotional about it, you know, about the doubt that I had within myself at the time and this doubt that I wouldn't fit in. I was worried about getting accepted. I was worried about not being accepted by my Black peers.
You were feeling vulnerable. And that's okay to feel vulnerable.
Yeah, but it still stings. It really does still sting. I always think about what it would have been like if I went to an HBCU, how my life would be different.
I get that. I absolutely get that feeling. I kind of felt similarly. I, once upon a time, decided to go to an HBCU. And then later, I decided to leave that HBCU because of a lot of things and a lot of feelings in your head and in your heart. And we're going to talk about all of that in today's episode. But first, let's hear from Stacey Abrams.
My mother tricked me into Spelman College.
Stacey Abrams, Georgia politician, voters' rights advocate. She ran for governor.
Most of my classes until I graduated from high school were with kids. I was usually the only or one of a handful of Black students.
She was the one who registered hundreds of thousands of Georgia voters to cast their ballots in the 2020 presidential election.
One key for both parties, obviously, voter turnout. For the Democrats, they believe they have an edge in those efforts led by former gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, who lost a close race for governor in 2018.
She changed the face of Georgia politics in general.
When I moved to Atlanta in 1989, I was a junior in high school, and that was the first time I was in classes with more than a few African-American students, but still I was one of the only.
Her family was one of the few Black families in a largely white neighborhood. This was in Gulfport, Mississippi. But her parents made sure she had a strong Black household.
When I got ready to go to college, my mother said that she was concerned about my social development because I wasn't shy, I was just very reserved. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have a lot of friends. I wasn't like socially awkward. I was just it sounds more like I was a loner, but I didn't spend a lot of time hanging out with other people. Mm-hmm. Partly it was my parents' fault because I have 5 brothers and sisters. After a while, everyone's just exhausting. Mm-hmm. But my mom said, just apply. You don't have to go to Spelman, just apply. So I applied. But every other college I applied to was in the Northeast. And then I was admitted, and she said, well, you don't have to go, just go visit. And I went to visit, and 2 things happened. One, I saw Morehouse College. I wasn't allowed to date until I was 16, so I was a junior in high school before I was eligible to date.
So this was opening up some options for Stacy.
Uh-huh, and it was sounding appealing.
And the first time I saw a school of all black men who were fairly good looking, particularly to someone who had been in a drought situation for most of her life, was a very compelling reason.
Eyes were opened. Eyes were opened, yes.
Very much open.
Very appealing.
All right, tone it down.
And then I met Janetta Cole.
Janetta Cole was the first female African-American president of Spelman,
who had the voice of God.
In communities across our nation and our world, there is a crying need for peace, for justice, for equality for all people.
This serene power, and it signaled to me, like, this place has this woman, and who could I be if I were in this place?
So Stacy ends up going to Spelman, and on her first day, she meets her roommate.
Lovely person. She was from Detroit, and she was much more facile with colloquialisms than I was. No, I wasn't just Southern. I was from Gulfport and did not hang out with a lot of kids who were versed in black colloquialisms. And so she said something to me, and I could not tell if she was being friendly or threatening me. And I was like, Rakai, I don't know what you're saying. And so by the end of the second week at Spelman, my new friends had put together a Black Urban Dictionary for me.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Which I think they meant both as a moment of mockery and as a moment of help, but I will reach for any dictionary I can get.
All right, so Stacy's friends were helping her out, though she says she was a little offended.
And embarrassed because I didn't know. There were things I hadn't experienced, music I hadn't listened to, communities I'd never engaged. And what was so tremendous about Spelman was that you hear this notion of being black as a monolithic experience, but when you strip it down to black women, when you remove almost everything else, you realize just how deeply diverse we are.
Ooh, I recognize that chant. HU is Howard University. And Leela, I told you I went to Howard for a little bit, right?
Yeah, you did. And I know you're about to tell me a little bit more about it. But before we get into your experience at Howard, we are going to talk to 2 other young women that went to Howard about their experiences as Africans at a HBCU.
HU, you know, I like my H in front of my B in front of my C. I like or love my HBCU.
So Esther and Nama both go to Howard.
At the pinning ceremony at Howard, when we first got there, I just felt so awkward, like, oh, there was like a prayer, and then I believe we did the Black National Anthem. I didn't even know we had a Black National Anthem. Me neither.
They had some things to learn at first.
I mouthed it like I act like I know it, you know. I do have an acting background, somewhat. So I just acted like I knew the words, kept my fist in the air.
There's Esther. Her background is from Cote d'Ivoire and Jamaica.
My name is Esther Okosi. I'm a graduating senior English major and a secondary education and history double minor at Howard University. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago.
And then there's Nama, who is from Sudan.
My parents are both immigrants, and I moved to Indiana when I was about 2 years old.
Nama said when she was in high school, she had enough.
It was a really, really white high school. Like, I'm not even going to lie. Like, It was majority Caucasian, and I've always, like, felt like I didn't fit in, like, this deep feeling. And I was like, what is this? Like, why do I feel so, like, different here? And so I just, like, went out of my way, and I just, like, educated myself and, like, read, like, did a bunch of research. And basically that was when I think my sophomore year was when I was, like, woke, I guess. And I was like, I need to get out of here, and I need to go to the most blackest place I can find. And that's when I found Howard. And I was like, oh my gosh, this place looks literally perfect. And I basically just set my sights on it. Even though my parents wanted me to stay in an in-state college, I was always against that. And coincidentally, I got rejected from all the colleges in state, and Howard accepted me. And I was like, that's God right there.
There were some things that she had to get used to.
I didn't know the dances or the cultural references sometimes. And so I always just felt like I wasn't that kind of Black person. And then when I came to Howard, I feel like I kind of carried that, oh, I'm not Black enough with me, which is kind of what stopped me from just being comfortable. But I feel like the most important thing to remember is that no one there is judging you. Like, I feel like personally, I just felt like everyone knows that everyone is different. Everyone comes from different parts of, like, the world. And if you just, like, accept your Blackness the way it is, then you're going to find a home there.
Hannah, you went to Howard and you left. And I wanted you to talk to me about that. Like, what was that experience like?
So I went to Howard for like one semester, finished a semester. Then 9/11 happened. And 9/11 was a huge, huge moment, of course, for the country, for the world. But for people who look like me, it was really a big deal. And it shook us as, like, Muslim people, the Muslim community, a lot, you know. And it was traumatic because there was that backlash, if you remember, right? There was a Muslim backlash, and we were looked at suspiciously, and all of those feelings. At the same time, like, there was this, I had already kind of been feeling out of place at Howard.
Why?
I don't know what it was. I think I relate a little bit to what Esther and Nama were saying about, like, trying to find what kind of Black you are, and like that feeling of not fitting in 100% because you feel like you're a different kind of Black. So I was already feeling that, and then 9/11 hit, and it was like, you know, that feeling just, like, multiplied and became so amplified of just feeling just out of place and, like, not belonging.
And are you saying that you felt this way because you were a hijabi Muslim woman on campus?
I definitely looked different, right? Like, that was a time when, you know, there was a lot of support for visibly Muslim people, like Muslim women who wear scarves.
You didn't even know if people were looking at you because they wanted to, you know, reach out to you, or if they were giving you the side eye. Like, everything felt the same at that time, right?
Absolutely. And because for a lot of us in the Muslim community, there was something that happened to us that at that time, right? Like, we felt something deep. And so was it me projecting? Maybe. But either way, I felt it. And soon after that, I left.
It pains me to hear that you had that experience there, or that you had that feeling. It's also like a sign of the times to see what's changed over the years. I mean, there's a lot of different experiences that young, African Muslims are having at HBCUs.
I was really just taken aback by just how diverse the African diaspora was, and just meeting different people from all over the continent, and even just from the Caribbean, even Black people who lived in Asia and in Europe. It was just so, I can't really describe it. It was just like such an experience to just meet all these different types of Black people from all these different walks of life and socioeconomic statuses and ethnicities. It was just really something.
And it just was like a little safe bubble. And I remember when I came back to Indiana to visit my parents, I was like, oh my gosh, what are all these white people doing here? It's so weird. I was like, I'm so uncomfortable with this. I just want to go back. And it's just a really safe and comforting place. And that's why I really just want to make the best out of my college experience now, because I know the real world isn't like Howard. Howard really is the Mecca for Black people. That name is just so perfect and it suits it so well.
I mean, Leela, I love that. I wish I had that same feeling when I was in Howard. I love hearing that.
So their experience was very different from yours, Hannah, but you were also there at an extremely tense time in the country. And, at that time, though, too, Howard has had since 1977 the Howard University Muslim Student Association, to offer support for Muslim students. Is that something you thought about joining?
No, not at all. I don't think that thought was there at the moment. First of all, it is not my first thought to go join a Muslim student association because I'm Muslim. And I think a lot of people think that.
Well, no, I think I only say that because it feels like, they would offer you support.
Right. Well,
you'd find support there.
There was no organizing or anything like that at the time. To the contrary, the opposite of that. It was just everybody was in shock in their homes, not knowing whether to walk down the street. So no, that was not a thought that came to me at all.
A lot of this goes back to what you said earlier, which is there's this doubt that you start to have that you're not Black enough, that you're not American enough, that you're just not enough. But there's also something that's really relieving to hear Esther say about her experience as an African at a HBCU.
I feel like at Howard was the first time I've seen people appreciate my Africanness and be interested in it.
I've always admired it when people say HBCUs are like a part of their family tree. It's like a part of their heritage, their family story. And you told me you come from an HBCU family.
Yeah. I mean, both of my parents went to HBCUs. My dad went to Hampton University in Virginia, and my mom went to Fisk in Tennessee. And honestly, I don't think they even thought about not going to an HBCU. I don't think that was even an option.
Maybe that's because for many Black folks, that's just what you did, right? There were no questions asked. It was just assumed that you were going to an HBCU.
In the mid-1800s, during the Reconstruction era, a lot of Black people escaped to the North, and then they set up these informal spaces to learn, to read, to gather. And, they were in churches, mainly organizing to create spaces for Black people to thrive. In 1865, there was this effort from Congress to finally allow land to be designated for HBCUs. And Black people wanting to start and run their own colleges began to build institutions.
Black thought was thriving. W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington were all HBCU grads.
Some of the very first HBCUs were Clark Atlanta, Shaw, Fisk, Howard. What ends up happening is a Black middle class begins to emerge.
And today, there are 107 HBCUs across the country.
I remember walking on that campus and just feeling like, whoa. This feels so good. Like, this just feels...
Was that immediate?
It was immediate.
That's Nalika Radway, and some of our listeners may be familiar with her voice. She was on our last episode about moving abroad, and she also went to Howard.
I remember walking up the hill. You pass the sign, Howard University sign. I'm walking up the hill. It's late summer, and there's just like Black folks everywhere, and they're just like, it was literally a different world. I was like, literally, I'm in a different world right now. How did this happen? Okay, great.
And there was something about her experience at an HBCU that really stood out for us.
So I applied to Howard University, and I got in. I found out I got into Howard University when I showed up on the campus and was like, I haven't heard back yet. And they were like, oh yeah, you got in. It was like classic. Everybody who's gone to Howard has a story like this, where it's just like shoddy. Like, some of like the process of the administrative stuff is like shoddy.
Nalika grew up in the Bronx and, and she lived in a mostly Jamaican neighborhood. And she actually went to school in Massachusetts before Howard. And being in that school, it was a huge culture shock for her.
I was completely overwhelmed. Like, you talk about racial identity development. I went straight into my Malcolm X. I no tolerance for any of it. State.
She went from a very Black space to a very white space, and then she decided she needed a very Black space.
It's the Mecca. Like, I know. And I think the reason we call it the Mecca is like the idea of like, it's a homecoming. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's part of your process. When you get there, we were waiting for you.
She's arrived.
When you get to Howard, it's kind of like you get to put it down. You get to put it down. So like what I got to do at Howard was explore and examine all the other aspects of my identity. Learning about where I have privilege that I didn't like. I never thought of myself as someone with privilege. And I get to Howard and people are like, well...
While the University of Massachusetts presented one kind of challenge for Nalika, Howard presented another. She had to reckon with some things.
So we're in this media class and there was a question around privilege and imagery and all of it. And so we were taught, like, I think the professor may have asked a question or maybe a student asked the question of like, who here considers themselves to be like light skin or to have light skin privilege. And I remember sitting like just looking around, wonder who they talking about? Who's about to raise their hand? I wonder. And a classmate of mine, we were having a dialogue and she said, I'm surprised you didn't raise your hand. And I was like, why? And she said, like, you have white features, but your features, like your nose is straight and like your hair is a particular thing. And so I would think you benefit from that privilege. And I had never thought about it before. I had never because I grew up around other people that looked like me that had, I'm Jamaican. Colorism is a real thing. I recognize all of it, but I never saw it in myself. And so being in that space, I got challenged around something, but it also felt like it was a supportive enough environment that I could engage with that conversation. I was excited about the challenge. I was excited about, I felt like that person was really brave to say that to me.
You know what I love hearing about Nolika's story? It's this fear that she's going to have this experience of being called out. And she completely took this as an experience to learn from.
You start to feel what kind of Black you are. Maybe you're made to feel what kind of Black you are. We're all Black, but what kind of Black are you? And what kind of Black are you? And what kind of Black am I? And so it becomes more nuanced. And I feel like all of these people...
Did you feel that when you were there?
Absolutely. And I feel like that's where all these things come out from, like Nolika was just saying, right? Like the colorism, whether it's Nama and Esther trying to figure themselves out, whether it's Stacey Abrams, it's belonging, and there's a focus when everybody's Black. It feels like,
and that vulnerability from having that doubt about yourself, it's real, and it's not something a lot of people talk about, because for a lot of people it's embarrassing. It's calling out a side of you that you feel proud of, but you're also feeling timid about, like something that, Stacey Abrams had shared with us. It doesn't feel good to say that you have regret about making a choice because you were doubting yourself. And at such a young age, when you want to be defying people's expectations of you and taking risks.
Yeah, and when we did talk to Stacey Abrams about all of this, the hesitation, the feelings, the vulnerability, there was something she told us that we need to remember.
I think no matter where we are in the diaspora, there are always moments where we don't feel like we're enough. Mm-hmm. We don't feel Black enough. We don't feel down enough. We don't feel courageous enough. And part of my underlying mission is to know we are enough. We are more than enough. We are more than sufficient for the moments we face. But we can't see that unless we take the time to know it and talk about it and acknowledge it's the secret we all carry, and until we put it in the open, people are going to continue to suffer under its weight.
And that is The Stoop.
I got my S in front of my T. My T, two. I got my S in front of my T.
Ooh.
2 O's in front of my P.
Oh.
Stoop, 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 stoop.
Yes.
Stoop, 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 stoop. Stoop, stoop.
S in front of my T, 2 O's in front of my P.
Ooh, 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 ooh. Our team includes producer Natalie Peart, music by Daoud Anthony, and sound design by Seth Samuel.
Support for The Stoop comes from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the NEH. Find them at calhum.org, and a special thanks to the NPR Story Lab. S in front of my T. The S is in front of my T.
I feel like we're spelling something vulgar.
Because the 2 O's are in front of my P?
Yeah.
Girl, goodbye. Bye.
Okay, I'll talk to you later.
That's from The Stoop. They are just wrapping up their 7th season now. Brilliant show. Thanks to the whole team over there for letting us run this episode, and go check out the show. And thanks to you for listening to all of these pairings. We'll be back with new episodes next time, but as I said, this was inspired by letters we got from listeners pointing out the connections between our show and other shows. So if you hear good pairings out there, not just Radiotopia shows, but wherever, let us know. Maybe this will be a thing we do from time to time. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.